The hatchery manager looked embarrassed. I hate asking this. Margaret Hale smiled. Go ahead. He pointed toward a stack of wooden trays sitting in the corner of the loading dock. 320 turkey eggs. Perfectly clean. Perfectly intact. Perfectly unsellable. Margaret frowned. Why? They're too old for our commercial customers. She picked one up carefully. They're fertile. Most should be. But, he sighed. The chain hatcheries have strict rules. If they aren't set within a certain number of days. He shrugged. They get discarded. Margaret stared at the trays. So these become waste. Usually. How much? The manager smiled weakly. If you haul them away. He paused. They're free. Two workers standing nearby exchanged amused glances. One whispered to the other. Nobody's hatching those. The second laughed. They'll end up feeding pigs. Margaret looked back at the manager. I'll take all of them. The workers stopped laughing. You serious? She nodded. I've got room. Nathan Hale arrived 20 minutes later with a livestock trailer. When he saw the towering stack of egg trays, he blinked twice. That's a lot of eggs. Margaret smiled. 320. Nathan lifted one tray. They really gave them away? They couldn't sell them. He looked confused. So, what's the plan? Margaret carefully secured another tray. We're going to hatch turkeys. Nathan laughed. 320 of them. We'll see how many cooperate. The Hale farm wasn't known for poultry. For nearly 30 years, Margaret's family had raised sheep, goats, and a few heritage chickens. Turkeys had never been more than a Thanksgiving curiosity. Yet Margaret had always admired them. Not because they were flashy, because they were surprisingly hardy. Her grandfather Samuel used to say something few people believed. The old turkey breeds are better workers than people give them credit for. When Margaret was 12, she watched a flock of heritage turkeys wander through an apple orchard. Instead of damaging anything, they hunted grasshoppers, beetles, and ticks all day. Samuel smiled. Most people only see dinner. She looked up. What do you see? Farmhands. Years later, those words returned unexpectedly. The farm had struggled through 2 difficult summers. Grasshopper outbreaks, tick populations, increasing feed costs. Margaret wondered if one solution had been walking around farms for centuries. Back home, she converted the old brooder barn. Every incubator she owned came out of storage. Friends loaned her 2 more. The eggs had to be handled carefully. Temperature, humidity, turning schedules. Nothing could be rushed. Nathan watched her labeling trays. You've got charts. Margaret smiled. I always have charts. He laughed. I should have known. The veterinarian stopped by later that week. He looked through the incubator window. That's ambitious. Margaret nodded. Maybe. You know hatch rates could be low. I do. The eggs are older than normal. I know. He smiled. Still trying? Absolutely. He laughed. I figured. Every morning began the same way. Margaret checked temperatures, recorded humidity, turned eggs, candled each tray. Some eggs showed nothing. Others revealed tiny growing embryos. Nathan became fascinated. I can actually see them. Margaret smiled. So can I. Day after day, the numbers slowly improved. Many eggs remained viable despite their age. The hatchery manager called one afternoon. Just curious. Margaret answered. About what? The eggs. We're getting development. Silence. Seriously? Looks promising. I honestly didn't expect that. Neither had the workers who laughed. News traveled quickly through the farming community. Naturally. One Saturday morning, Dale Harper sat inside the diner drinking coffee. Rick walked in smiling. You hear about Margaret? Dale looked up. What now? She's trying to hatch 320 discarded turkey eggs. The room erupted with laughter. Dale shook his head. Turkeys? Rick nodded. Free eggs. Another rancher joined the conversation. Probably free for a reason. More laughter followed. Dale smiled. I suppose we'll find out. Margaret entered moments later carrying fencing supplies. Dale waved. Morning. Morning. He grinned. So. She smiled. So. How are your imaginary turkeys? They're still eggs. Laughter filled the room again. Margaret simply paid for her supplies and left. She had more important things to do. 26 days later, the first egg cracked. Nathan nearly spilled his coffee racing toward the incubator. It's happening. Margaret was already there. A tiny beak tapped carefully through the show. Hours later, a damp little poult stumbled into the brooder. Healthy. Alert. Hungry. Margaret smiled. 1. Nathan laughed. Only 319 to go. The hatch continued through the next 3 days. Not every egg survived. Margaret expected that. But far more hatched than anyone predicted. Tiny bronze poults filled the brooders. Peeping echoed through the barn from sunrise until long after dark. Nathan finished counting late Sunday evening. He walked into the farmhouse carrying the notebook. You ready? Margaret looked up. Tell me. 237. She blinked. What? 237 healthy poults. Silence. She smiled slowly. That's over 70%. Nathan nodded. Better than some commercial batches. The hatchery manager drove to the farm himself. He stood quietly watching hundreds of healthy poults exploring their brooders. Finally, he shook his head. I threw away the best hatch I've seen this month. Margaret smiled. They just needed a chance. The poults grew astonishingly fast. Within weeks, they followed Margaret everywhere. Unlike commercial breeds, these heritage turkeys flew onto fence rails, perched in trees, explored every corner of the farm. Then something unexpected happened. The grasshopper population around the sheep pastures began shrinking. Nathan noticed first. You seeing this? Margaret looked across the pasture. Hundreds of young turkeys moved through the grass like a slow-moving wave. Every few seconds, one snapped up another insect. Grasshoppers, beetles, ticks, anything they found. The sheep grazed peacefully behind them. The veterinarian returned during midsummer vaccinations. He watched the birds for several minutes, then quietly laughed. I forgot how good heritage turkeys are. Margaret smiled. At what? Pest control. He pointed across the pasture. They're cleaning everything. By late summer, neighboring farmers began asking questions. Not about eggs. About the birds. Why were Margaret's pastures greener? Why did her sheep seem less bothered by flies? Why were there fewer grasshoppers near her fields? Nobody connected the answer to 320 discarded eggs. One afternoon, the county agricultural extension agent stopped by unexpectedly. He spent nearly an hour walking through the farm, watching the turkeys work, watching the sheep graze behind them. Finally, he stopped beside Margaret. I've got a question. She smiled. Go ahead. He looked toward the enormous flocks spreading across the pasture in perfect formation. Exactly how many insects do you think those turkeys are eating every single day? The extension agent watched the flocks spread across the pasture. The birds moved like a living wave. Every few seconds, one snapped up another grasshopper, another beetle, another tick. Finally, he lowered his binoculars. Exactly how many insects do you think those turkeys are eating every single day? Margaret smiled. I've never counted. Nathan laughed. I'm glad. The extension agent nodded toward the flock. You don't have to. Silence. They're doing the counting for you. Over the next month, he returned several times. Not because he doubted what he saw, because he wanted proof. He placed insect traps in several pastures. One pasture held only sheep. Another held sheep and the growing turkey flock. Every week he collected samples. Every week the numbers changed. Grasshopper populations dropped dramatically where the turkeys worked. Tick counts fell. Fly larvae became harder to find. The sheep grazed more comfortably. The pastures recovered faster. The extension agent closed his notebook. This is remarkable. Margaret shrugged. They're just being turkeys. He smiled. Exactly. That autumn brought another challenge. Feed prices climbed again. Many poultry producers complained about rising grain costs. Margaret noticed something interesting. Her heritage turkeys spent most of the day finding food on their own. Seeds, acorns, wild berries, green plants, countless insects. They still received balanced feed every evening, but they consumed far less purchased grain than commercial birds. Nathan checked the records one afternoon. We're using almost 40% less feed than expected. Margaret nodded. I noticed. He smiled. So Grandpa was right. She looked across the pasture. He usually was. One Saturday morning, the diner conversation sounded different. Dale Harper folded his newspaper. You hear about Margaret's turkeys? Rick looked up. What now? The extension office measured the insect populations. Silence. They're way down. Another farmer frowned. Really? Dale nodded. My neighbor says her sheep hardly stomp at flies anymore. The room grew quiet. Nobody laughed this time. Margaret walked inside carrying fence staples. Dale waved. Morning. Morning. He smiled. So. She looked amused. So. I owe those turkeys an apology. Margaret laughed. They probably won't notice. Winter arrived gently. Unlike previous years, the pastures entered dormancy healthier than anyone remembered. The grass recovered better. Parasite pressure seemed lower. The veterinarian noticed first during routine flock inspections. He compared this year's records with previous seasons, then looked at Margaret. Interesting. She smiled. What? Your sheep required fewer parasite treatments. Nathan leaned closer. Seriously? The veterinarian nodded. I'm seeing healthier pasture conditions. He pointed toward the flock of bronze turkeys scratching through old grass. I don't think that's a coincidence. The hatchery manager visited shortly before Thanksgiving. He had not seen the birds since they were tiny poults. Now magnificent heritage bronze turkeys roamed the hills. Their feathers shimmered with copper, bronze, emerald, and purple in the afternoon sunlight. The manager stood speechless. I gave these away. Margaret smiled. You did. He watched a large tom spread his tail while another searched for grasshoppers beneath an oak tree. I can't believe it. Silence. I almost threw away an entire breeding flock. Margaret gently picked up one young hen. They simply needed time. The hatchery manager looked thoughtful. I've been thinking. She waited. We still discard older fertile eggs every season. Margaret nodded. I know. What if? He paused. We sorted them instead? She smiled. What do you mean? Instead of throwing them away. He looked across the pasture. Offer them to small farms first. Margaret extended her hand. I think that's a wonderful idea. The following spring, the hatchery launched a new surplus egg program. Discarded fertile eggs no longer went directly into waste bins. Small family farms could purchase or collect them at minimal cost. Hundreds of eggs found homes instead of landfills. Several beginning farmers started heritage poultry flocks they otherwise could never have afforded. The local newspaper noticed. Its front-page headline read, "From waste to working farms." The story spread throughout the region. Agricultural colleges invited Margaret to speak. Not about incubators. Not even about turkeys. About seeing opportunity where others saw disposal. During one presentation, a young farmer raised his hand. What made you believe those eggs would hatch? Margaret smiled. I didn't. The audience looked surprised. You didn't. She shook her head. I believe they deserved the chance. Silence filled the room. I knew some would fail. Long pause. But I also knew they would all fail if nobody tried. The audience applauded quietly. By the second summer, the original flock had matured completely. Powerful toms strutted proudly through the fields. Healthy hens nested beneath hedgerows. Natural reproduction began. Margaret no longer depended entirely on incubators. The flock sustained itself. Nathan walked through the pasture one morning, carrying a notebook. Guess what? Margaret smiled. What? We counted 43 wild nests. She laughed. They've decided they like living here. One autumn, a neighboring orchard owner stopped at the farm. He had heard about the turkeys. My apples are getting hammered by insects. Margaret listened. I wondered. He hesitated. Would your flock work in an orchard? Margaret agreed to try. After harvest, several dozen turkeys moved through the orchard for weeks. They scratched beneath every tree, consumed fallen insects, cleaned countless larvae from the soil. The following spring, the orchard owner called. You need to come see this. Margaret drove over. The difference surprised even her. The orchard floor looked cleaner. Insect pressure dropped noticeably. The owner smiled. I've sprayed less than ever. Word spread again. Soon vineyards, berry farms, nut growers, even vegetable producers began asking similar questions. Not because turkeys solved every problem, because they solved some naturally. One evening, Dale Harper leaned against the pasture fence watching the flock drift toward their roosting trees. The setting sun turned every feather brilliant copper. He folded his arms. You know what still bothers me? Margaret smiled. What? I laughed. Yes. I called them garbage eggs. You did. He shook his head. They weren't. Silence. They were opportunities. Margaret nodded. They always were. The old hatchery manager joined them. He watched hundreds of magnificent heritage turkeys disappear into the evening woods. I've worked around poultry for 35 years. He smiled. And I almost missed the best flock I ever produced. Margaret looked toward the birds. They produced themselves. She simply gave them the opportunity. As darkness settled over the farm, Margaret remembered one of Samuel's favorite lessons. He often said it while gathering wind-fallen apples after storms. The farm wastes very little. She had asked what he meant. He smiled. Nature usually finishes what people abandon. Standing beside the great bronze flock, Margaret finally understood. Months earlier, 320 turkey eggs sat forgotten in a hatchery corner. Workers saw expired inventory. A disposal problem. Something no longer worth the shelf space. Margaret saw possibility wrapped inside fragile shells. Not certainty. Not guaranteed success. Only possibility. 237 poults eventually hatched. They didn't merely become beautiful birds. They restored pastures, reduced insects, helped sheep thrive, inspired new poultry programs, created breeding stock that other farmers sought. and reminded an entire farming community that value isn't always determined by how quickly something sells. Sometimes the greatest harvest begins with whatever everyone else has already decided to throw away. By the time the original flock filled the hills with shimmering bronze feathers, nobody remembered laughing at the discarded eggs. They only remembered the farm that proved discarded opportunities sometimes hatch into the strongest future of all.